Howdy. This is part one of creating a custom 120-gallon vivarium for my corn snake. I'm going to be in this video constructing the actual tank itself as well as the background so that you can see kind of my process. I wasn't able to get everything since I am just one person in the middle of a shop in the desert, just recording this video on my own, but I'd like for you all to join me just to see my process for creating a PVC vivarium. Let's go ahead and introduce the main character of today's story. This is... She's been my first reptile since I started getting into this hobby. I've had her for about 4 years now, and she's been in this 40-gallon vivarium most of the time I've had her, so I'd like to make her something a little bit bigger so she can stretch around, since she has gotten really big, going from a snakeling to a full-grown fat creature that she is today. So, let's get started. First thing we got to start off with is cutting the PVC, and you had to get it onto a cutting sheet. Usually it's best to do it with two people because working with an entire sheet by yourself can be pretty annoying. No one told the idiot on screen that, so that's what we're having to look at over here. But moving on to it, the first thing I would recommend is always keeping your work area relatively clean, because as this goes on, it is going to get very, very dusty. So before we even cut, the first thing you should do is measure out the exact sheet you're looking at, because I ordered a sheet that was 4 by 8.5 inch thick. However, as the specs were advertised, I actually got an extra 1/16 of material on the edges, and it was about 1/32 short of half an inch thick. Which, if not accounted for with the calculations, is when you're cutting it, it can definitely throw off some of the measurements. Even a 1/16 of an inch can just completely shift how the sheets fit together whenever you're going for the final product. So I ended up removing an extremely small amount from the edge. It was really difficult because I didn't have the proper tools for it, but that's neither here nor there. From here we're going to cut out the sheet panels. Now the dimensions always change with the enclosure, but always be mindful of where your pieces are going to rest. So if you want a 2-foot tall enclosure, you got to be sure to cut an extra ½ inch from the sides so that they sit flush on top of the base piece you're going to be using. I'll be keeping dimensions simple this time, just going for a simple 2-foot by 4-foot. However, later on you're going to see I do add a little bit of extra length up top with something I add on, so it didn't actually come out to that 2-foot I was aiming for. Always be sure to use saw blades rated for PVC to avoid chipping. Usually fine-tooth saws do just the trick, but I'd always double check the blade you're using to make sure you're not going to accidentally melt the PVC as you're cutting. And with me, I have a saw guide here that helped me keep consistent cuts as I moved along down the piece. But if you don't have one handy, then you can just clamp down some boards to where they can help you guide that saw across. That should do just fine with your cuts. Be sure to take your cuts steady so you don't accidentally jump the blade and create inconsistent divots. But from here, we're just going to finish out all the sides. I'll catch you whenever we're done with that. Once you're finished with all the cutting, you're going to want to move on to dry fitting. This is just to make sure that your pieces sit nice and flush together. Just make sure you watch out for any major gaps along the sides. And along the top, you want to make sure that it's nice and even so that when we get the eventual frame on there, it sits nice and flat. Next, we're going to want to assemble the enclosure itself. Here I'm just screwing the edges down, Played around with some of the PVC cement and adherence in the past, but personally, screws and silicone lead to a nice, firm, and watertight enclosure, but do whatever you're most comfortable with. It doesn't really affect the outcome as long as you're comfortable doing it. I would recommend multi-purpose screws, such as what I'm using, the GRK number 8 1.5 inch screws that I'm using here, but always be sure to drill pilot holes. I go with the number 6 bit with a countersink, and always watch your angle of entry as it's going in. You should put about a good 6 to 8 inches between each screw hole and about 2 inches from the edge. And of course, as you go through the enclosure, be sure to use clamps to keep the whole thing uniform so it doesn't jostle around. I'm just using some cheap clamps I got from Harbor Freight, and they're doing the job just fine. We're going to want to go ahead and just screw in all 4 of the pieces we've cut so far. We're going to go ahead to avoid screws on the front so they don't show through. We're going to put the 2 sheets on the side and the sheet on the back. They're going to rest on top, the bottom, and get screwed up. And the side is going to get rested in the back going in. We're going to try to avoid using as many screws in the front as possible just for a nice clean look. For the front, I actually do something a little bit different. Instead of just cutting up a sheet, I actually do get some PVC trim I find at my local Lowe's. I don't really enjoy the texture, but I work with it. I use the 1.5 inch trim for the top and the 7 1/4 trim for the bottom. They're both about 3/4 inch thick and make an excellent spot for the sliding track we're going to install later. Once you get these pieces screwed in, it's mostly complete, and you should end up with
the cube.
From here, we can move on to the wire cap. I'll be using it to get wires in and out of the enclosure just to make things a little bit easier. For this, we're going to need to cut about 2 3-inch holes on the back panel, one on both sides. They'll be cut to personal preference, so you can put them up a little further or a little lower, it's up to you. But I'm going to be using these, the Toxerium wire caps. While they aren't meant for tanks this size, they're meant for fairly thinner enclosures. We can use silicone to kind of fix that issue. Once they're sealed in, you can go ahead and clamp them in just to get them extra secure as the silicone cures. But from here, we can move on to siliconing the edges of the enclosure itself. Before you start, you should be sure to use some isopropyl alcohol and microfiber cloths to clean up any oils or debris. Both should usually be found at your local hardware store. I find some at Ace. You can get giant bottles of isopropyl alcohol. You can use aquarium-safe silicone here, or if you don't have any available or don't want to get it, you can get some General Electric silicone. You got to make sure it says Type 1 up at the top there. Type 2 won't usually work because it has some toxic additives that are put in to prevent mold growth, and that can leach into the water and the substrate of the tank, so we usually try to avoid that if we can. But here we evenly apply a bead into every corner seam, and after smoothing it over with either your finger or a tool, you can leave it as is and leave it sit for 24 hours to let that cure. After the 24 hours, you can actually run a water test to ensure the seams are good. It's not a necessity, it's usually just a precautionary measure, but you don't need to wait on the silicone to cure before moving to the next step. Now here's where things changed a little bit. Originally what you've been seeing has been recorded around June. I wanted to use an expensive resource for the background to get a specific look, so I was waiting to buy it. I did come to regret using that resource later, but we'll go over that later. At the time though, while I was sitting there waiting, I had an idea for the top. This part is completely unnecessary and you do not have to do it. I'll explain more about that later. But my idea is to create an inset frame for splined window screen to sit in so they can be removed at will instead of being screwed down and hard to remove later on. This also allows for some customizations, but it's used with turn buttons to get it into a nice clean look. So the first thing we're going to want to do here is we're going to cut about 8 pieces of 2-foot trim using that same 1.5 inch frames we were using before. You'll need about 8 of these in total since 4 makes one 2-foot frame. So for a full 120 gallon enclosure, we're going to need about 8. Once you get those first 4 cut, you can actually go ahead and move on to the next section. So this is kind of why I say it's not necessary. I went and bought a decently cheap router and table combo and used a 3/4 inch flat router bit to carve a solid groove into the actual PVC itself so that the frame can sit. That's why I'm saying it's unnecessary. You don't need to get a router to make this work. The depth of your cut is dependent on just how thick your window screen frames are. If you have a thicker window screen, you may want to go a little bit thicker, but you just want to make sure that there's a little bit of a lip so that those turn buttons have something to bite into. So you're just going to want to go just below the depth of your window screen. And also, depending on the texture you want, you can either use the textured side or the smooth side if you're using what I'm using. Once all 4 of those pieces are ready, what we're going to move on to next is getting a 45-degree miter cut into it. Luckily for me, I have a laser guided saw right here with a guide on it, but if you need to be extra careful, you can use a 45-degree speed square to get that angle proper. Be sure to take it slow and just go through these pieces one at a time, and make sure you're always cutting the right face. To keep the textured side the right face, I actually make sure whenever I'm doing the first cut at that 45-degree angle going out, I have the textured side up and I hit the right side, and then I flip it over on its head, press it against the support board, and then cut the other side, and that gets you a nice 45-degree angle cut you're going to be using to make that frame complete. You're going to want to go ahead and complete this on all 4 frames, and then we can move on to the next step. So moving to the actual frame here, with this case I did use screws in conjunction with corner clamps. The corner clamps came from Harbor Freight, but in hindsight I would rather have used PVC cement with the clamps so that I can get a clean solid finish with no hardware, because as those screws bit, they did pull a little bit, throwing off those perfect clean corners. So whatever is up to your preference, I would recommend PVC cement with some corners. Speaking of cement, I actually learned from my mistakes as I went along and used PVC cement to join the 2 frames after they were finished into one. In this case, I'm using OD Fusion single-step PVC cement. I slathered both sides generously and clamped them together while the cement did its thing. Now, after about 24 hours, what you're going to want to do is you're going to actually screw down the top frame. I just went ahead and measured out where I'd be putting the holes. We're going to be putting them about 6 to 8 inches, kind of how we did for the sides and the bottom. Once you get those measured in, what you're going to want to do is clamp down the frame so that it doesn't jostle around as you're screwing, and go ahead and just start sinking screws in, making sure to countersink the whole time so that they don't tear the edges of the frame. Once that's nice and secure, we can go ahead and move on to the next step, which is the window screens themselves. Now, the window frames themselves should be available for most hardware stores. Same with the spline and the aluminum screen you're going to need. But when you're cutting the screens, account for the size of the actual corners you're going to be using. The ones I have in this case are about 3/4 of an inch, so with 2 you get about 1.5 inches you need to make sure you cut out from the frames so they're not added in. But you can also leave an extra 1/16 of an inch off so that when you get the frame into these recessed bits, they actually have a tiny bit of wiggle room and aren't just really stiff. I would recommend using aluminum screen as it resists corrosion and it holds up really good with heating elements, so it'll be a little bit more resilient. You should check the spline size of the specific window frame and screen you're using. They usually have them on the packaging, but just be sure to be wary of that. Splining is a bit weird. I would recommend finding a couple video tutorials before you do this step, as while I may be able to do it here, there's a lot more people qualified than I am about it, because I'm right now just a monkey slamming a weird plastic tool into a small crevice hoping it doesn't come out bad. But once done, you should be left with a small square frame. You'll go ahead and create a second frame, and that should leave you with the top tier 120 gallons. For those who just skipped the top frame entirely and don't have a router, don't want to step through this, you can spline some window screen into the size of the enclosure, so 2x4, and screw that frame down directly. It should give you a bit of a rough look, but at the same time it still holds up really good. As you can see here, I've used it on an enclosure in the past before I went full Psycho Murderer with the special tools. After everything's nice and secure, we can actually move on to the background. Now, I'm going to be completely honest here, I did not like how this background came out. It'll hold up well, for sure, but I wouldn't recommend this method for a couple of reasons. So, The foam, as you can see here, holds onto the surface material, but it's so sensitive, even a small graze as I'm just going past this exposes foam, and now it's just this black mess. Now, no amount of testing actually could fix this. I, as you can see here, have dozens of pieces that just each flaked off. In the future, I would just recommend sticking to the good old-fashioned spray foam and carving trick. That being said, let's get into the background as I made it here. First, we're going to start with the hardscape. We're going to use some tape, some hot glue, and eventually expanding foam. We get the sticks oriented the way we'd like and use some painter's tape to hold them into place so they don't move around much while we work on the rest. You can take some hot glue here, touch up the corners of the sticks just to keep them a little bit more solid, but I also used hot glue to seal on these 4-inch plastic planter pots. This will help with some of the vining plants if you just want to get a little texture in the background. This is great for that. The reason I would recommend using hot glue and keeping it at an angle is because I've tried having tilted planters in the past. It just didn't work out. But what I like to do is, after everything's said and done, I would love to foam down pieces of cork bark around the pots themselves and also add a little bit of extra foam around the bottom of the pots so it creates this kind of stalactite textured appearance. At least I'd like to say that. However, my phone died as I was recording that, so hooray. Instead, what survived is what we have here. Essentially, after everything, the first layer of foam is cured, what you're going to want to do is just go back and revisit. Take larger chunks of cork if you have them available, and just seal them into the background so they don't move around much during the final cure. What I'm taking here is a large chunk of cork I have with some moss on it, putting it over one of those flower pots we just put back in, and I'm basically using some more of that standard grate stuff to seal around it to make sure it's nice and firm on the background before moving on to the next step. Once you let that sit for 12 hours, we can finally move on to the background itself. In this case, I'm using Pond and Stone grate stuff since it's animal safe and comes with a black color. What I'm doing here is I'm just going around spraying it in unnatural patterns, trying to cover every inch of the exposed background, avoiding cork where I can so I can leave that as much exposed as possible. You just wrap it around the flower pot. I use small chunks of cork to kind of hide the flower pots themselves, but you can do any method you want. But you're just going to go around and spray, making sure to cover all the white background if you're using white PVC. Once you get a little bit closer to the end, you can move in segments, or you can do it all at once. I'm just putting in a couple last touch-up spots here before I move on. Once you're done, you're going to go ahead and start taking some sphagnum moss, sprinkling it over the foam, and then once you have some moss on there, you could take either sphagnum peat or cocoa coir. You got to make sure it's as dry as possible so it actually adheres. Well, adheres as best as it can. Once you get that on, you're just going to go ahead and firmly press it in, trying to get as much of it in as possible. As you can see here, you got to do a lot of patting, making sure every single inch is smothered. Once you're done patting it down, you're going to let it sit for about 12 to 24 hours. Then we can move on to the final cleanup step. I'd recommend having it over a tarp when you do this so you can collect the dust, but what you're going to want to do is just tip the enclosure over and dump any excess. Give it a good tap so you can get off all the fine loose particles. I just fully lift the enclosure about like a Neanderthal, but you can do whatever you want. I would recommend you do have a shop vac on hand just so you can give it a nice little cleanup after, because this does definitely get really dusty really quickly. But once you're done with that, you should be left with your first side. From there, we're going to want to move on to the last two sides. I'm just going to show the background here since the left side's just the same as the right. For the large background, you do want to move in 1-foot segments, unlike what I did here. If I ever revisit this method, I'm going to have to keep in mind you got to move in 1-foot segments on larger pieces like this. But as I go through, I add in small chunks of what I have available on hand, and then I just go ahead and add the moss and the sphagnum peat to get that final texture. This method did work alright, but it did come out with a good final, but it didn't last that long. As you can see here, you have a nice looking background that looks like it should hold up good, but once you run your finger through it, it just did not hold up much to physical touch. If you can make this method work, please let me know so I can come back and revisit it. That'd be greatly appreciated. Next, we're going to be adding in the sliding glass track. Be sure to cut it to the size for your enclosure, so make sure to measure the distance between the two walls. I usually end up getting a 4-foot track, so I have to cut off just a little bit. I do get these 1/4-inch sliding glass panel tracks off of Amazon. But I'll go ahead and leave a link in the description for them. To install it, we're going to add a bead of silicone across the entire bottom of it and firmly press the track into those 1/4-inch trims we use for the front. Using painter's tape, you're going to be able to hold down the track once it's aligned, and we let that cure. Make sure the larger track is installed up top. That's what the glass is going to go slide into and then press down. So make sure that larger track is always pressed into the top so it's easier to install. So while the track is curing, we can actually cut out what goes into the track. I like using acrylic personally because it's easy to work with, shatter resistant. However, it's pretty bad with scratches, so always keep that in mind. I get 1/4-inch thick acrylic off of Amazon as well. I'll also leave that in the description. I usually go with large sheets because I do multiple enclosures at once, but if you just want to stick with smaller amounts, that's completely fine. I actually cut a little bit underneath the length of what I measured, so that front gap was 14 inches. What I'm cutting here is 13.75. You should go around 1/2 inch just to be extra safe, but always be sure to double check the lengths before you start cutting. So the reason I cut it 13.75 instead of 13.5 is I'm going to take it to a router. So I do this to smooth off the edges and get down that last little bit of material. So to smooth the edge off, we lightly sand the cut edges just because they're going to be a little bit rough from the circular saw. And then we run it through the trusty router I got specifically for the top trim, but it's coming in handy here too. This allows a seamless transition, so it's able to slide along that track with no issues. No need to do any sanding beyond running it through the router. If you don't have a router available, it's more than safe enough to just take some sandpaper and just spend a little bit of time smoothing it out. Once those doors are looking nice and done, we can actually move on to installing the handles. You can actually use adhesive handles here if you have any available, but I personally like using cabinet handles because they look really nice. I know I'm a sucker for aesthetic. From here, I just measure out exactly where I want those handles to go, and then I go and drill in a pilot hole, and then just sink in a screw through the bottom using rubber washers to keep them nice and secure. And just twist on a handle. For this case, I'm going with a golden handle I just had on hand because I like to spoil my little corn snake. So, just like the top frame, this part is also completely optional. What I'm doing here is drilling a 1-inch hole on the interior sliding door piece. I drill it 1/2 inch from the edge of the other piece. The reason I do this is I use a 3D printed lock. If you don't have a 3D printer, a normal showcase lock is completely acceptable. You just don't even drill a hole then. I'm just using it here to put this lock in. So I 3D printed these locks here to use with my enclosures since metal locks don't really look good to me. Also, I don't really need a lock because I'm the only person down in the reptile room. So I trust anyone who comes in because I'll be watching them. So the lock slides right into that 1-inch hole. You can twist the latch, and the pieces between basically kind of become an acrylic lock. So you can't even shake that in and out if you wanted to, and the pieces sit firm together. We're on to the last finishing touches with this enclosure. To start off with, we're going to be spray painting the entire thing black. If you like white, go ahead and keep it white so you can just skip this step entirely. All I did was add some painter's tarp to the inside of the enclosure to protect the backdrop and the floor. I did completely forget to do something. You could take some cardboard and put them into those frames we cut out if you did that method so that none of it goes inside from the top. So you protect the inside of the frames as well, but that's an unnecessary step. You just need to go around and paint however you wish. And I would recommend using any type of spray paint that has a primer inside of it so that it lasts a little bit longer. You could rough up the surface as well if you wanted to get that extra security, but I didn't bother with that. I just used a 2-in-1 spray paint. After everything's said and done, let that sit overnight, potentially just to let it off gas, so make sure it's in a well ventilated area so all the paint can dry and you're ready to move on to the next step. All there is really left is to install the turn buttons to keep the window screens in place. I didn't like the ones from my local hardware store. They just came with a couple super small white turn buttons. I just 3D printed my own, so they came out way more resilient than the ones you can find in the hardware store, but you still can get them from the hardware store. Now with all that out of the way, the enclosure should be good to bring inside so we can begin getting it set up for the spoiled princess herself. I'd recommend having someone help you move the enclosure, especially if you're moving it downstairs. Unluckily for me, I'm hard-boiled and just brought it down myself. Thank you everyone for who stuck around to this point. I'll be sure to upload part 2 when Maze actually gets moved into the enclosure after about a month or so where the plants have to take it some time to get rooted. Thank you everyone and have a wonderful day.